Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog, and we return back to Christopher Lasch's magnum opus, Culture of Narcissism. Now, I've been doing these commentaries and readings to get people to actually read these books, exploring with you long passages of how they might be relevant and how maybe you should approach them. This is an educational thing, and I'm in dialogue with these books, but I'm not going to read them for you or to you, all right? You need to read these books. Get them on tape. Get book on tape, on CD, on MP3, on Audacity, as we like to say. All right. This is one of the most interesting observations of this book. And I want you to think about how a lot of things we attribute to social media about branding, the hollowing out of the self, etc., if Lasch is correct, have a much longer history going back to some of the social implications of Fordism. I'm going to start reading now. This is on page 28 if you have this edition. From Politics to Self-Examination. Having displaced religion as the organizing framework of American culture, the therapeutic outlook threatens to displace politics as well, the last refuge of ideology. Bureaucracy transformed collective grievances into personal problems amenable to therapeutic intervention. In clarifying this process, this trivialization of political conflict, the New Left of the 60s made one of its most important contributions to political understanding. In the 70s, however, many former radicals have themselves embraced the therapeutic sensibility. Rennie Davis leaves radical politics to follow a teenage guru, Maharaji J. Abbie Hoffman, former leader of the Yippies, decides that it's more important to get his own head together than to move the multitudes. His one-time associate, Jerry Rubin, having reached the dreaded age of 30 and having found himself face-to-face with the private fears and anxieties, moved from New York to San Francisco, where he shopped voraciously on an apparently inexhaustible income in spiritual supermarkets of the West Coast. Quote, in 5 years, Rubin says, from 1971 to 1975, I directly experienced Gestalt therapy, bioenergetics, Rolfing, massage, jogging, health foods, Tai Chi, Esalen, hypnotism, modern dance, meditation, Silva mind control, Arikna, acupuncture, self therapy, Raukian therapy, and Morehouse, a smorgasbord course in the new consciousness. In his curly title memoir, Growing Up at 37, Rubin testifies to the salutary effects of this therapeutic regime. After neglecting his body, he gave himself permission to be healthy and quickly lost 30 pounds. Health foods, jogging, yoga, sauna baths, chiropractics, and acupuncturist all made him feel at 37 like 25. Spiritual progress proved equally gratifying and painless. He shed his protective armor, his sexism, his addiction to love, and learned to love myself enough to not need another to make me happy. He came to understand that his revolutionary politics concealed a Puritan conditioning. He occasionally made him uneasy about his celebrity and its material rewards. No strenuous psychological exertion seemed to have been required to convince Rubin that it's okay to enjoy the rewards of life that money brings. He learned to put sex in its proper place and to enjoy it without investing in symbolic meaning. Under the influence of the succession of psychic healers, he raged against his parents and the righteous, the punitive judgment within himself. It eventually learned to forgive his parents and his superego. He cut his hair, shaved his head, and liked what I saw. Now I entered rooms and no one knew who I was because I didn't fit into their image of me. I am 35, but I looked 23. Rubin sees himself, a journey into himself, as part of the consciousness movement of the 70s. Yet this massive self-examination has produced few indications of self-understanding, personal or collective. Self-awareness remains mired in liberationist cliches. Rubin discusses the female in me, the need for a more tolerant view of homosexuality, and the need to make peace with his parents, as if these commonplaces represented hard-won insights into the collective human condition. As a skillful manipulator of the common coin, a self-conceited media freak and propagandist, he assumes all ideas, character traits, and cultural patterns derived from propaganda and conditioning. Apologizing for his heterosexuality, he writes, "Men do not turn me on because I was propagandized as a child to think homosexuality is sick." In therapy, he attempted to reverse the negative programming of childhood by convincing himself that a collective deconditioning provide the basis for social and political change. He has tried to build a rickety bridge between his political activities in the 60s and his current preoccupations with his own body and feelings. Like many ex-radicals, he has succeeded only in exchanging the current therapeutic slogans for political slogans he used to mouth with equal disregard of their content. Rubin claims that the inner revolution of the 70s grew out of the awareness that the radicalism of the 60s had failed to address itself to the quality of personal life and the cultural questions, and the mistaken belief that the questions of personal growth, in his own words, could wait until after the revolution. This accusation contains certain amounts of truth. The left has too often served as a refuge from the terrors of inner life. Another ex-radical, Paul Zwig, has said that he became a communist in his late 50s because communism released him from the failed rooms and broken vases of a merely private life. That's in quotes. As long political movements have accessed a fatal attraction for those who seek to drown the sense of personal failure in collective action, as if the collective action was somehow precluded rigorous attention to the quality of personal life, political movements will have little to say about the personal dimension of social crisis. I want you to ask yourself, after the full labor votes and all this, how much we see now. I have noticed since COVID the proliferation of both therapy ads and therapeutic language by people who cannot afford to get therapy. So you go to therapy TikTok and learn the correct language to deal with your inner grief and your vagal imbalances. But you have largely abandoned the political project because the political project seemed vain. And this is part of the background of Lasch's other work that isn't in this book, but was in his other work. The projects of the past had failed. And that is part of why the turn to the self made sense, but it's also prompted by the structure of Fordism. And he saw this in what would be considered in classical psychoanalysis secondary narcissism. Primary narcissism is a different deal. But we'll have to go into this because Lasch, as I've been pointing out in my readings of his sequel to this book, The Minimal Self, which came out in 1984, we see a very, he realizes that the narcissistic culture that he's writing about and its categories that he pulls from people like Erik Erikson and Norman Brown and Philip Rieff, that it's changing, but maybe into an even more narcissistic culture. Now, I know that people will hear this and go, well, you're not using the DSM definition of narcissism. In fact, the current DSM doesn't even have narcissistic personality disorder on the books anymore. It was taken off because it's too vague. And I realize that. I want you to remember what I teach you about definitions. The definition of narcissism that is being used in this book is particular to psychoanalysis as it was understood in the 1950s and 60s. Our current definitions are basically what the APA, the American Psychological Association, agrees on for the coding of billing for insurance. If you understand the difference in those definitions and maybe what they describe, you'll understand that we're talking about different things. So if this seems broader and vaguer, and in some ways it is, that's a fair accusation, it's not because Lasch thinks that the entire culture has the narcissistic personality disorder. In fact, he would see that as itself a sign of therapeutic judgment and of trusting psychiatrists too much. Lasch was not anti-psychiatry. He wasn't part of the anti-psychiatry movement, but he was skeptical of the way therapy was being used, particularly in the 1970s. And see, now we are going through a similar cycle. And it seems to presage something. There's a major shift in political economy happening. The kinds of public rhetoric and image-based you know, diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives that we saw throughout from the beginning of the Obama administration's admission that we weren't post-racial, which no one with a brain would have thought, to now we do see that as the academic institutions are beginning to really falter, the humanities are beginning to totally fail. Elite opinion is more carteled than it even was because of paywalls, so this just not as engaged with as much. And increasingly, people don't see the benefit to anything beyond practical education in college. We're going to see a lot of shifts in culture away from um, a lot of the political jargon that we've used that was also very hollowed out. I think we've seen a cycle that really begins with the failure of the social movements in the 1920s, and Lasch's early career is all about documenting that, to now. And you see all these figures from the New Left become the baby boomers, right? What do you think is happening to younger millennials and Gen Zers today? They're not the same, all right? The baby boomers were the recipients of decades of accumulation, and the United States was in the best position of wealth after World War II, just because this wealth was not primarily destroyed in the war, and it was able to rebuild a kind of transatlantic state apparatus with Europe doing that, right? And then eventually integrating a lot of East Asia, both Japan, then South Korea, then even China, into parts of that apparatus while shutting out the quote global South, Africa and Asia, Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Well, Latin America was kept as as raw extraction. You don't want your neighbors getting too powerful, and from classical geopolitics, that's actually a pretty predictable pattern. What does it say about our culture? Right? Why do when people read the culture of narcissism in the aught teens that it hit a nail that it didn't hit in the aughts in the 90s? Right? This seems more true now than when I first read this when I was in my 20s. But also our political and economic situation is so different. We are at the end of a different period of economic organization. We know we're at the end because the tricks that we're able to maintain, the growth of the 90s for part of the population and only the richest part in asset appreciation seem to have run out. And we do have to rebuild the physical infrastructure again and go back to the real economy. And we're going to see this increasingly in things like tech layoffs, because a lot of that was based off of playing games with debt, leverage, and investments and all that. But we have also seen that the bourgeoisie itself is somewhat stagnant in responding to these needs. It just can't do it anymore. They're not the right people. Let's ask ourselves a few questions then as we continue. Yet the new left, unlike the old left, and remember he's talking about the new left of the 60s, not the new left of the aught teens, did begin to address this issue in a brief period of its flowering in the mid-60s. In those years, there was growing recognition, by no means confined to those associated with the new left, that the personal crisis on the scale that it has now assumed represents a political issue in its own right, and that thoroughgoing analysis of modern society and politics has to explain, among other things, why personal growth and development have become so hard to accomplish, why fear of growing up and aging haunts our society, why personal relationships have become so brittle and precarious. And you have no idea, brittle and precarious personal relationships are real easy now when you can block anybody. And remember what I've talked about from the American Social Forum. If you go back and watch my prior videos where I linked that, you will see that like Americans from the 70s to the 90s have progressively lost friends. And from the 90s to now, it's gotten really, really bad. So people who once felt like they had a strong, vibrant friendship community now don't. Hence the fetishization, I think, of a lot of things like the queer community. And I'm not saying that to disparage the queer community, but found families and friendships are part of that culture, and other people are now jealous. Now, why they became that, AIDS epidemic, constant oppression, etc. All right. But, and let's really deal with this. There is a sense of solidarity there that people want, and because it implies a sense of friendship. Hence the expansion of the categories. But as you expand the categories, it becomes more and more like general society and less effective at fighting the alienated trends in which we see. Anyway, that's my gloss on what we're seeing right now. Back to the 1970s. The emergence in the 60s of a new literary form combining cultural criticism, political reportage, and reminiscence represented an attempt to explore these issues and to illuminate the intersection of personal life and politics, in politics, history, and private experience. Books like Norman Mailer's Armies of the Night, by deposing of the Convention of Journalistic Objectivity, this is the new journalism, often penetrated more deeply into the events than accounts written by allegedly impartial observers. The fiction of the period, in which writers made no effort to conceal his presence or point of view, demonstrated how the act of writing could become a subject of fiction in its own right. The cultural criticism took up the personal autobiographical character, which at its worst degenerated into self-display, but at its best showed an attempt to understand the culture that had come to include the analysis of the way it shapes their own critics' consciousness. Political upheavals injected themselves into every discussion and made it impossible to ignore the connections between culture and politics. By undermining the illusion of culture as separate and autonomous development, uninfluenced by the distribution of wealth and power, the political upheaval of the 60s also tended to undermine the distinction between high culture and popular culture, and to make popular culture an object of serious discussion, which we've seen again for the past few decades, so much so that there is no real distinction between high culture and low culture anymore. If anything, high culture is the stuff of weird nerds like myself who do not necessarily have wealth and are not showing distinction by this enjoyment anymore. You can just go on YouTube and have people discuss Jean Dalman. And now it's, the head of the Sight and Sound poll, right? And Jean Dalman's a great movie. I love the movie, but it is odd to me that it's considered the best movie in the world by people who used to consider more mid-tier, mid-brow stuff like Orson Welles to be peak. And I call Orson Welles mid-brow not because I think it's bad. I think Orson Welles is excellent, but I think it's been part of middle-class culture that regard Citizen Kane as one of the best movies ever made, even if you've never watched it. Same with Stanley Kubrick. Now we're in a moment of political reckoning, but also a lot of very elite high culture, such as Nouveau films from Belgium in the 70s, has become more accessible. It has spread throughout the culture, but there is no distinction. And you can also likewise go into high culture academia and read all kinds of stuff about comic books and Marvel movies. I'm not here to judge this one way or the other. I'm just saying that if one form of distinction has gone away because of the collapse of the distinction between high and low culture, then other forms of distinction come up. And I've been telling people that it's been knowing how to signal that you are not just have the right politics, but that you have the right politics in the right way by volunteering for the right organizations, etc. And if you don't believe me, this is pervasive in our culture. One thing I will say about Chat GPT, even though that it combs the internet and uses prior to stuff to 2020 to build its worldview, because of the dominant in print culture in the aughts and aught teens of a particular worldview, that Chat GPT has a political bias that's inculcated by the aggregated information that pulls from the internet. All right. Machine learning is generally pattern aggregators, and it's only as good as the patterns it aggregates. So it's going to reflect a kind of middle elite view back onto you because they were the people who dominated print culture for the last 20 years, particularly what's available on the internet for a program like ChatGPT to scour and use this as predictive text. These become feedback loops. We should be skeptical of them. I'm not saying this because I want a conservative ChatGPT, because we're likely to get one eventually, believe it or not. This is how these things work, right? You have mutually constitutive counter signaling, which eventually gets mutually constitutive tech. And I think we're also going to see a lot of the rentier people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. We already see it with Musk become more and more conservative as they no longer have as much largesse and have to actually protect something, to conserve, to protect. Come on, think about it, people. All right. I hope this discussion of the early chapters of Culture of Narcissism helps you. I'm not saying we live in the same time or that Culture of Narcissism is a perfect book for predicting it, but I find it unbelievably useful because, unlike many of the left-wing books, it doesn't try to separate culture from politics from economics. They're all viewed as interrelated. And that goes down to not determining your personality or who yourself is, but limiting the way your personality can be expressed. We should distrust our current therapeutic turn, not because therapy is inherently good or bad. There's great therapies and there's plenty of people who need them. I'm not telling you there isn't. But we should ask ourselves, why is this become a cultural phenomenon? And there's a lot of stuff going on right now. Lots of real traumas, both personal and societal, going on. But there's been lots of real traumas for most of human history. Therapeutic time periods seem to occur in almost decade-long cycles and are really seemingly tied to the secularization of society. We need to ask ourselves deeper questions about this. Ones that I find both the left and right-wing answers to right now to be insufficient. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell if you like these little explainers. I'm going to be doing a lot more of them. I've discovered that these are well received, even if they don't always get tons of views. They're evergreen. And while I'm still going to do the interviews and really appreciate them, I would rather do 4 to 6 interviews and really do them well and be fully present for them than, a month, which is still a lot more than a lot of other people. I mean, I remember when we started podcasts, we'd expect to do an interview a month. People, you demand a lot more. And we all know that podcasts and YouTube streams and stuff are dying in popularity because people have to go back to work. Their height of popularity is 2020. That should surprise no one. All right, and with that, like and subscribe. I have a Patreon if you want more material, a couple monthly Q&As. You'll get the audio versions of these solo things and the interviews without ads. Have a great day.